Greetings and salutations. This is Zion Builder. Now, two major events in Israelite history that maybe don't get enough attention are the Exodus desert wanderings and the exile into Babylon. Each lasted for decades, and each was clearly understood at the time to be their God placing them through lessons so that they would become the people He desired them to be. But what exactly were these lessons? And do they mean anything to us, the people of the present? Short answer, yes. Long answer, we all know the story of the Exodus. If you don't, it's that God, with Moses' help, freed the Israelites from Egyptian bondage. I'm going to focus on the fact that after a year of trekking, they made it to the bountiful land that their God had promised them. The only problem was, it was well defended, and the Israelites, who didn't trust in their God's power, concluded that they couldn't take their opponents. As a result, God commanded them to stay in the wilderness until that generation all but died out, and then their kids were allowed to take over Canaan. The exile is a little less well known. While in the land of Canaan, the Israelites eventually became a kingdom. That kingdom eventually split into the northern Israel and the southern Judah, and both of them fell into apostasy. The northern kingdom got overrun by Assyria and then merged with other conquered nations to become the Samaritans. The southern kingdom, a few generations later, got invaded by the Babylonians, and most of the people who were captured were then taken back to Babylon. Before Jerusalem fell, though, God sent prophets, such as Jeremiah, to explain the situation, and that they would eventually be allowed to return home. These, in some ways, are pretty similar situations. First point of note is that God was very clearly with them in both cases. He had put them through trials, but He wasn't gone. Even though the Israelites doubted God's ability to help them beat the Canaanites originally, He did help them win a couple battles in the desert, including against King Og of the Bashites. In the Babylonian exile, He famously defended the three friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, from burning alive in fire. God also promised deliverance, and told both Moses and Jeremiah what would happen, and when God would allow it to end, so that they could put their hope in Him. However, in a lot of ways they were different. The post-Exodus wanderings only lasted 40 years. 40 is well known to be a number of trial in Jewish culture. Think Noah's 40 days in the ark, or Jesus' 40 days in the desert. And it was also linked to how long they had sent spies into Canaan to survey the land for. However, this number was almost doubled by the exile's 70 years. Now, 7 is the number of completion and the number of the sacred covenant for Jewish people, but I wanted to focus on the length itself. The longer trial shows that they needed to be better prepared. There was no room for failure similar to how the past went, and, indeed, post-exilic Judaism's fallings are a lot more subtle than their forefathers. Instead of rejecting God Himself with polytheism, their mistakes could be summed up in following the letter of the law instead of the heart of it. Still, the extra time seems to have helped boost their loyalty and their rejection of false gods. Another difference was the way of their survival. Being in the desert for 40 years, they had to depend on God directly for their food and water. And even though He didn't appreciate their whining, God indeed did send manna from the heavens and water from the rocks. This made His presence clearly known to them and let them understand that God was the source of life itself. During the exile, the Israelites, specifically looking at the Jews, were part of the pagan culture and had access to all the food they could find. This wasn't inherently a good thing. As one story points out, Daniel and his friends object to eating food that took part in polytheistic ceremonies, and are the better for it. This is displaying the importance of demanding that your food, and hence life, is second to God. Quite a turnaround from demanding that your God be used for food. The exile gave the Israelites a second chance to correctly order this mindset. The biggest and most obvious difference, however, is the placement of this people. In the desert, God had separated His people from all the nations and was preparing them to be a country, a political entity that was separate from all the other nations. They were to depend on their God and not on alliances or treaties. In the exile, the chosen people were spread throughout the Gentile world. They had to mingle with the pagans, work with them, travel with them, all while still being faithful to their God. I believe that this difference came to be for two reasons. One is that such a sturdy faith glorifies God all the more, and back in the desert, the society as a whole was simply not ready to display that resilience. The second, and more important I feel, is that they were being prepared for the next big step. Of course, the Jews would be ruled by the Gentiles until the 1900s, so for thousands of years, and such resilience would prove useful. But more to the point is that this is good practice for after Jesus ascends and bestows the Holy Spirit upon His church. The Christian church for hundreds of years, and perhaps again these days, was completely surrounded by opponents of the faith. The Jewish society needed to be a society that was ready to embrace their faith, no matter what the culture did, because they were meant to be Christianity. And just like the Jews could not succumb to polytheism in the exile, Christians could not and cannot succumb to secular or polytheistic forces. So, what lessons can these give us, millennia later? Well, the post-Exodus desert wanderings can show us that sometimes we need to get away and further ourselves from people who are bad influences. If we aren't strong enough to avoid being corrupted, then there's no shame in walking away for a bit. We must care for our own souls. We need to take time to commune with God, who will be with us always. But it also shows us that these periods shouldn't be too long. Now, the exile shows us what we are to be. We must be a church inside our world, but not transformed by it. We need to order our food and lives to God and reject magazines, video games, TV shows, or whatever that may lead us away from our source of life. Well, I hope you found watching the comparison as interesting as I did making it, and I hope you did not let the lessons of the past go to waste simply because they were from so long ago. And a little reminder, you are called to be a light to the nations, and until next time, God bless and good luck.